Gross. I'm the senior folklorist at the Library of Congress at the American Folklife Center, and I'm a folklorist and ethnomusicologist with a PhD in American Studies. Well, folk is a catch-all phrase. Do you mean folk music or folklore? 40 years or so, the term folklife has gained ascendancy in American ethnographic circles, because for a lot of people interested in looking at the traditional basis of culture, it's not just the music. A lot of, almost every group has customs and traditions, ways of dressing, housing types, farming and occupational lore that doesn't necessarily involve music. But the folk music and traditional music genres are part of that larger traditional basis of how cultures are ordered. Well, folk music is sort of a catch-all phrase. In the United States, for the last 60 years or something, it's meant, well, folklorists tend not to use the term traditional music, not folk music, because folk music has become so diffuse that it doesn't necessarily mean anything. And it was sort of captured by singer-songwriters starting in the 1940s to mean a certain type of low-tech music that's often involved singer-songwriters, or for the folk revival. In fact, there are all sorts of folk music within the United States. Some of it ethnic, some of it religious, some of it very regionally based. So I think to the average person, folk music has been co-opted by singer-songwriters, and there's nothing wrong with that. But to go back to that old saying that all music is folk music because animals don't sing songs. So it's all sung by people. There's an older layer of song that, so we're excluding, by doing that we're excluding classical music. You see, it makes me uncomfortable to say folk music per se because it's so huge. Guitar, by the way, is a very late addition to traditional Anglo-American music. It only came in the late 19th century. Before then, a lot of music was sung unaccompanied, or to banjo, which is, in fact, has somewhat older roots. Musicians always steal from one another, so there's within folk music there are a lot of different genres, but those genres are very porous, and the styles are more set than the repertoire. Which a song that could start off as a popular Tin Pan Alley song written by known composers can easily become a folk song. They can be taken and made into a rock song and taken again and included in a classical composer. Traditionally, the way folk music was defined was songs that were widely known, that did not seem to have a known author. So anonymity was part of defining something as folk music. That's actually not a terribly good way to look at it, because all songs started with someone and all songs are always changing. But what tends to be true about folk music is there's no one set version. No one's owns it, so there's no version that's the right version. To be good at any music, you have to spend huge amounts of time in practice. Sing-along for folk music doesn't necessarily make you a good folk musician. It just makes you a participant. And certainly types of sing-along songs that everybody knows are more accessible, or seem more accessible, but to be really good at it takes thousands of hours of practice, just like it would for a classical musician. I was out the other night at a bar in New York where there were traditional musicians playing Irish music, and they knew, each one of those people knew hundreds and hundreds of tunes. You just don't pick up a violin and play at that level because it's all a feel-good, let's sing along song. So if you're talking about people who are really good at folk music, then that's something different. The kind of participatory music that has become, be thought of folk music, isn't necessarily uh, what folk musicians look for. If you go out to find a ballad singer who's taken the trouble to memorize hundreds of different songs, then that's a very different level of expertise than being able to sing camp songs. So is folk music more welcoming? Yes. The entrance level might be lower, but to be really good at it, you also need to spend a lot of time and thought and energy to do it. Same with people who folk songs, folklorists used to go back and forth whether folk songs sprang from a singing, dancing throng. In the 18th and 19th century, they thought it welled up from the folk simultaneously. Obviously, if you've ever worked with a committee, you know that people in a group don't necessarily think of things together. There always are people who have a knack for writing songs or for modifying songs. What tends to happen is that someone will come up with a song and then people will modify it. The culture will modify it. So if someone writes a 12-verse narrative ballad about something that happened as a really good singer-songwriter, after a couple hundred years, there might be 15 variations of that, and there will be from 4 to 8 verses each. I think part of that was a whole 1960s folk revival, hootenanny, but behind that idea is a political idea. It's a class-based political idea that was put forward, especially really starting in the 20s and 30s, a lot by the people who tended, it wasn't always, but tended to have inclusive social ideas from left-wing political causes. And the fact that folk music was used often as organizing in political struggles. Well, John Lomax and his son Alan Lomax were collectors. John started collecting about the First World War in Texas. He was particularly interested in cowboy songs. He was a banker by trade, but like a lot of early folklorists, and a lot of people who do collecting today, they weren't necessarily formally trained, they trained themselves. John was collecting at a time before tape recorders or mechanical recording devices became hugely popular. So his earliest collecting was done in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, was transcribing, noting down songs and transcribing. He eventually got a job at the Library of Congress in 1932. And he brought along his teenage son, Alan, who he gave a job to fairly early on. And Alan worked for the Library of Congress for a few years. Mechanical recording devices, easily portable mechanical devices came into play at that point. So first, it didn't used to be, well, let me back up and say, when wax cylinder recorders came in, some people took them into the field, but they were clumsy and hard to use, and they could only record about 3 minutes tops at a time, which for a lot of the longer, especially any sort of longer musical genre, was not adequate. You could get halfway through a long narrative ballad and you could get 4 verses, and then the other 12 verses you couldn't record. So when first aluminum disc recorders and then wire recorders and tape recorders came in about the time of the Second World War, it became easier and easier for field recordings to take place. And both John Lomax and Alan took to this form and started doing long trips under the aegis of the Library of Congress, recording, especially in the South, and, well, really all over the country. Alan did recording in the upper Midwest in 1939 and upstate New York. Both John and Alan, sometimes together, sometimes separately, did a lot of recording in the American South. They were rather Catholic in their tastes, so they would include a lot of blues recordings and jazz recording. Alan's noted for being here at the Library of Congress one day when a man named Jelly Roll Morton came in and said, "I invented jazz." And Alan Lomax had enough common sense to know that he was a character. He said, "Well, let's go down to the auditorium and record a couple of stories." And Mr. Morton turned out to be such a great narrator. He probably didn't invent jazz, but he was involved in New Orleans music in the 1890s, about 1900, when jazz was taking form as a major American genre, and he knew all the personalities involved. And they sat on the stage at the Coolidge Auditorium here at the library for 3 solid days, recording one story after the other, and that's become a very important document. So both Alan and John Lomax were noted for that. John Lomax left the library after a few years, and Alan Lomax left the library after by the late 1940s. He was gone from the library, but he continued to do a lot of recording throughout the world, and his recordings eventually came back to us about 10 years ago when we acquired his collection here. So the Lomax recordings are very important, and the Lomax, especially Alan Lomax, well, actually both John and Alan Lomax recorded really iconic songs that have been recorded and covered again and again. For example, House of the Rising Sun, that became a major hit for the Animals in the early 60s. We have the original recording. We have a lot of the iconic songs that Vera Hall, who was a terrific singer that were recorded by the Lomaxes, recorded a song called Trouble So Hard that was taken by Moby a couple of years ago and set and became, he sampled it, but what he really did is took Vera's song and arranged it, did a great arrangement, and it went to the top of the chart. So a lot of, it's kind of we have a great touchstone for people to come and use. But the Lomax recordings are only one of several thousand collections that we have here. Altogether, we have something like 300,000 hours of unique recordings, and the American Folklife Center specializes in fieldwork recordings. There's a whole recorded sound division here that does commercial recordings. So we tend to have things that are one-off copies or original copies done in the field, often with local musicians or folk musicians. I would say non-professional, but a lot of these people did work professionally locally. They just were not part of the American music mainstream. It's only if you have a really simplistic understanding of what the term means. I mean, here we have, if you think it's Anglo-American music, you're only partially right. Traditional music in the United States includes Cajun, includes powwow music, it includes gospel music, it includes Cambodian dance, it includes Irish instrumental music, it includes, dozens, if not hundreds of different subgenres. The corridos from Mexico, if you're growing up along the Tex-Mex border, your idea of what you listen to as community-based music is radically different than it would be for sing-along with Mitch type strumming guitars. There are trumpets and harps involved in a lot of folk music. So there's not a form of folk music per se. There are many forms of community-based traditional music that are sustained throughout the United States by people who are perhaps not as commercially relevant as those people on the top of the charts, but to whom music still is an important part of their lives. There are hundreds of definitions, but it's traditional community-based music that is passed along from one generation to the other, but modified. It's always changing. Any healthy music, any healthy parts of culture is always changing. And I think that's great, because what was relevant 50 years ago might not be relevant to people today. If it's not relevant, it won't survive. Well, I don't know who has it. You keep saying that it's out there, and it might be your construct. It's not my construct. Music goes through cycles, and what's great about folk and traditional music is it's a touchstone that people keep coming back to.